occasionally things go wrong, and tragically last night or in the early hours of the morning in the UK, a lot of people have met their demise in a very tragic accident.
What do we know so far about this plane crash?
What's fascinating, obviously, as a military guy, I'm looking at this through a military lens. I mean, it's a tragedy. It looks like there were 64 people on board the Bombardier aircraft, 60 passengers, 4 crew. And there also seems to have impacted a Black Hawk UH-60 military helicopter, which had 3 personnel on board. Whilst they're clearly trying to rescue survivors at the moment, but I have to say the accident appeared to happen about 400 feet at about 140 miles an hour. And that's not very survivable. And the Potomac River is about 1 degree centigrade. So the last place you want to be doing, if there were any hopes of surviving, is ending up in a 1 degree centigrade water. So I have to say it looks pretty bleak for the people. I think there'll be an outstanding rescue effort going on, but my thoughts go out and prayers go out to those who have lost loved ones in this tragic accident.
And obviously this was a collision between the plane and the helicopter. We don't know the specific cause, but what would you say could have been behind this?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that we've got to be careful not to put too much conjecture, because there will be a full inquiry. I think what is interesting, though, that you can the Washington airspace around Reagan Airport is one of the most heavily controlled airspaces in the world. And what I mean by that is civilian air traffic is directed to go specifically down specific corridors to land on airfields, take off. They've got to go a specific way. They've got to follow a particular pattern, and there is no discretion allowed. So it's very procedural. It's heavily controlled. What happened on this particular night, though, was that there was a military aircraft also involved in that control zone. Now, that's not unusual, but those military aircraft, I know firsthand, tend to have a little bit more latitude, because the military aircraft, particularly in this case a Black Hawk, might well have been on some sort of special secret military mission. It may have been part of a security detail. It may have been part of President Trump's detail. Who knows? And therefore, they don't fall under the same rules. They are asked by air traffic. They're told to keep their eyes open, but they are much more left to their own devices as long as they understand. And they build a mental picture. When I was a military flying, they called it situational awareness. And I suspect that's what they're relying on in that control zone. The visibility was good. I think what the trouble is, the investigation is going to focus on this Bombardier aircraft. At the very last minute was asked to change runways. So it was asked to go onto a shorter runway 33 at Ronald Reagan. Now, that in itself is no great thing. What it does mean is that aircraft would have had to maneuver from its original flight path to reposition itself to come down on a different approach path to runway 33. And that actually took it over the Potomac River. And it would have been interesting, therefore, that the pilot of the military helicopter might have assumed that everything was coming down one way and up another way, up funnels to the main runway, and maybe didn't pick up the fact that this other aircraft was asked to do a different approach, therefore would be in a bit of the sky that he wouldn't have been expecting it to be. All of that is coherent with A, both aircraft falling in the Potomac River, and B, the radio calls from Dulles Tower, the Washington Tower, that basically said, military aircraft, have you seen this civilian aircraft? And there was no reply. That for me means that military guy wasn't expecting to see it, suddenly went, holy, which aircraft? Didn't reply. And tragically, that seems to have ended in a horrendous accident. Now, again, it's conjecture. The full inquiry will take part, but I suspect that's what they'll be focused on, to try to understand why those 2 aircraft were in the same bit of sky. I don't think it's coincidence that the civilian aircraft was invited on a different approach. And the only other thing I would say is that you'd expect these military pilots to have night vision devices in the cockpit. They will have. The Black Hawk is famous for it. I used to fly with night vision goggles and with forward-looking infrared. Very effective, but all of that is designed to operate in very low light conditions. A big airport like Ronald Reagan Airport and in the Washington area, bright lights everywhere, and they will massively reduce the effectiveness of any of these night vision aids. The pilots will be much more reliant on their eyeballs and situational awareness. It was a beautiful visibility that night, so their eyeballs should have been working fine. It was obviously some breakdown of that situational awareness.
And then finally, there's been some reports in that airport of a few near misses. including like a near collision that happened in May last year, which did raise alarm in some capacity. Were you aware of that? What do you think of that? Do you think that that is a potential contributing factor to this?
My own experience of civilian air transport, and particularly military air traffic control zones and civil air traffic control zones, is they are very good. They operate very tight procedures. But inevitably, these are very busy areas. There's lots going on. It relies on extremely well qualified, very well trained air traffic controllers to be on top of their game, and for the pilots, both military and civilian, also to follow controls or to listen carefully and understand. Tragically, human mistakes do happen. The one thing I know about the airline world is that every time there's even a near miss, we might think it's scary, but actually sometimes it's something fairly innocuous. But they try and learn from it. They try and change procedures to try and make it better. It is still the safest way for any of us to travel anywhere around the world. And that's largely a testament to the very high safety standards that are applied. But occasionally things go wrong, and tragically last night or in the early hours of the morning in the UK, a lot of people have met their demise in a very tragic accident.
I presume there's going to be an inquiry into this. Could you tell me what an inquiry would look like? What's the procedures that you go through for that?
Yes, whether it's a military accident or a civilian accident, and I suspect on this occasion that they'll both work together. There's an air accident investigation board that will sit. Initially, there'll be lots of questions about, the aircraft. Was the Bombardier CRJ-70 serviceable? Was the Black Hawk serviceable? Were they following the right procedures? It'll pull all the air traffic control tapes, the audio tapes. It'll pull the radar tracks. It'll work out where they were coming from and everything. They'll pull the accident data recorders from the aircraft as well. And it takes time, but all of that gets pieced together. And in my experience, it provides a very, very clear indication of what's going on. We tend to imagine, we've seen lots of these movies that, you have to find forensic ways to find out what happened. Most often than not, these modern accidents, because there is so much data stored, once you've got it all out and can play it all through, it becomes pretty evident what's happened. That does take time. But understandably, the authorities will absolutely focus on that in a very professional investigation, and lessons undoubtedly will be learnt from that.
Mm. Sean Bell, thank you very much.